Number 10. MARTA Elena Vento. After moving from Spain to England, 27-year-old MARTA Elena Vento took a job as an overnight desk clerk at a Travelodge hotel in Dorset. She was working alone one night in 2020 when a guest, later identified as 32-year-old Stephen Cole, brutally attacked her with a pair of scissors and bludgeoned her to death. The hotel's manager arrived at work a few hours later to discover the gruesome scene. A guest who encountered the carnage described seeing Marta's lifeless body crumpled in a corner near the reception desk and said that the walls and floor were soaked in blood. That same day, Cole entered a local police station and immediately confessed to the murder. He told the officers on duty that he hadn't got any sleep, but authorities would later learn that his problems ran much deeper than sleep deprivation. According to a court-appointed psychiatrist, Cole suffered from paranoid schizophrenia and was in the throes of a psychotic episode marked by delusions and hallucinations at the time of the murder. He apparently got the impulse to attack Marta because he disliked the way she smiled at him when they crossed paths that morning. Just days earlier, he had been kicked out of a different hotel for attacking guests. Cole had several prior convictions under his belt by then, including an assault against his own mother. And he had been released from prison just 2 months earlier, which meant that he was under the supervision of an offender management team. His overseers noticed that he was becoming agitated in the days leading up to Marta's murder, and they were allegedly aware that Cole had stopped taking his medication. But they apparently didn't realize just how dangerous he was to society and failed to take action to keep the public safe. Both the prosecution and the defense agreed that Cole was profoundly mentally ill and that Marta's murder was the product of a systemic failure rather than the defendant's personal wrongdoing. Cole pleaded guilty to manslaughter by reason of diminished responsibility and was institutionalized indefinitely under Britain's Mental Health Act. At his sentencing, Judge Angela Morris echoed the sentiments of the attorneys, describing the murder as a tragic and appalling incident. In a victim impact statement, Marta's father said that the family suffered from infinite pain after losing her. He called for every person responsible for his daughter's death to be held accountable and brought to justice, although it was unclear who he blamed specifically for the murder. During an inquest into Marta's death in early 2023, senior coroner Rachel Griffin criticized what she described as a lack of scrutiny over the circumstances of the case, which is now under further investigation. Number 9. Jordan Hightower. 31-year-old Jordan Hightower was working the night shift at a 24-hour convenience store in Arlington, Texas in early 2021 when he was senselessly shot dead during a robbery. The killer, 18-year-old Dorian Woodard, entered the store at around 1:30 in the morning and waited until all the other customers left. He then fired at Hightower multiple times during the botched burglary. According to authorities, Hightower wasn't even given a chance to comply with Woodard before he started shooting. The suspect then tried to open the register but was unable to, so he stuffed some merchandise into a backpack and fled on foot. 2 customers walked in afterward and saw Hightower injured and suffering, but they didn't seek help. They later told police that they thought he had just gotten into a fist fight and didn't want to get involved. By the time a customer walked in and dialed 911, an hour and a half had passed since the shooting. Woodard bragged about the murder afterward, while he went on the run for 4 days. Police caught up with Woodard right as he was leaving his father's apartment to catch an Uber out of town. Sadly, his decision to take someone's life inadvertently came with the added effect of ruining his own life. A jury convicted Woodard of capital murder in 2022, and he was sentenced to life in prison. He was also fined $10,000 for the crime. Number 8. Kerry Brown and Laurie Jones. 26-year-old beauty queen Kerry Brown was on her way home from working a night shift as a nurse in Ireland when she got into a tragic car accident in 2019. She had recently moved back to Ireland from England and was working at Kerry University Hospital when her car collided with a Jeep during her drive home. Paramedics rushed to the scene and tried to save Brown. Sadly, there was nothing they could do, and and the young woman was pronounced dead at the scene. In addition to being known as a fantastic nurse with a heart of gold, Kerry was a finalist in the London Rose of Tralee beauty pageant in 2016. The fatal crash came just hours after another nurse, 23-year-old Laurie Jones, died in a car accident on her way home from working a night shift in South Wales. She was last seen leaving her workplace in her scrubs and was missing for a day before her body was found in the Sahawi River outside Cardiff. Laurie's family had become concerned for her well-being when she failed to arrive home that morning. Sadly, she was found dead inside her car, just a mile away from her house. Number 7. Curtis PISHON. After having his career as a police officer cut short by multiple sclerosis, 40-year-old Curtis PISHON took a job as a nighttime security guard at a manufacturing plant in Seabrook, New Hampshire. A few hours into his shift on the 4th of July in 2000, his car mysteriously caught fire. He called the local fire department at 1:42 a.m., and responding firefighters got the blaze under control, but failed to determine the cause of the fire. They also noticed that PISHON seemed unusually calm for someone whose vehicle had just inexplicably burst into flames. PISHON's supervisor checked on him at his station at around 3:20 a.m., but less than half an hour later, one of his co-workers noticed that he had vanished. Because PISHON had a history of depression, investigators initially speculated that he may have suffered a mental breakdown triggered by his car catching fire, and that perhaps he disappeared on his own accord. But a witness reported seeing 2 cars speeding away from the plant at around the same time PISHON's colleagues realized he was missing, and police later discovered that someone had used a forklift to break into some vending and change machines on the property that night. No trace of PISHON was ever found. His cigarettes, lighter, and lunch were left at his workplace. His bank activity stopped completely, and his apartment remained untouched. He was declared legally dead in 2008, but his loved ones still long for closure and to know what happened to him that night. At this point, authorities believe foul play was involved, but they seem no closer to solving the case than they were more than 20 years ago. Number 6. Tina Milford. 23-year-old Tina Milford was abducted from a Lil Cricket convenience store in Anderson, South Carolina, while working the graveyard shift in 1983. She had asked to switch to days after being robbed and beaten during her shift several months earlier, and it was her final overnight. Tina was last seen alive at the store at around 1:30 in the morning. Around 2:45 a.m., a customer came in to buy coffee and noticed that she was missing, but that her shoes, purse, and other belongings were still at the store. It wasn't unusual for Tina to remove her shoes at work, but it was out of character for her to disappear in the middle of a shift without taking her things with her. Later that morning, a group of people discovered Tina's lifeless body while collecting cans along a dirt path about 12 miles, 19.3 kilometers away from the convenience store. She was partially undressed and had been shot in the head. Investigators worked tirelessly to try identifying the young woman's killer, but the case went cold. In 2018, law enforcement revealed that they had obtained a DNA sample from a piece of Tina's clothing, but they hesitated to go into further detail because they didn't want to jeopardize the case. That same year, Anderson County Coroner Greg Shaw told the Independent Mail that he believed Tina willingly got into the vehicle of someone she knew, thinking that she would sit and talk for a few minutes, and totally unaware that she was about to be kidnapped. Shaw wasn't the coroner when Tina was murdered, but he spent years poring over thousands of documents, following up on leads, and trying to solve the case. At the time of her murder, Tina was in the final stages of divorcing the father of her 18-month-old baby. Tony Milford reportedly told detectives that he and Tina were attempting to reconcile, but Tina's sister, Ann Hollingsworth, and other people disputed the claim. Speaking with the Independent Mail in 2018, Hollingsworth said that she believes Tony may know something about Tina's murder, but he was never charged in connection with the case, and he refused to take a polygraph after consulting with a lawyer. The case remains unsolved, despite the seemingly promising DNA evidence. Number 5. Deborah Poe. 26-year-old Deborah Poe was a hard-working woman with 2 full-time jobs. One of them was at a Circle K convenience store in Orlando, where she worked the graveyard shift 5 nights a week. It wasn't unusual for drunk and creepy customers to harass her, but the problem escalated when a naked man tried climbing over the counter and chased her around the store. Deborah's boyfriend, Scott Iaggi, began checking on her as often as possible throughout her shifts, but it sadly wasn't enough to protect her from the predator who abducted her during the early morning hours a few weeks later in 1990. Iaggi had stopped at the store at around 1 o'clock in the morning, and Deborah was fine. At around 3 o'clock a.m., a friend drove past the gas station and saw her behind the counter. Just 15 to 30 minutes later, however, a customer entered the store to buy cigarettes and encountered a man with long dark hair standing behind the counter. He seemed unfamiliar with the store's cigarette selection, but managed to operate the cash register without any issues. There was no sign of Deborah, and she hasn't been seen since. Her work smock was found neatly folded in the counter, and her car was in the parking lot. Authorities never identified the man behind the counter, and they don't necessarily believe he was involved in Deborah's disappearance. But they're still interested in speaking with him in case he knows any information pertinent to the case. It's been more than 30 years, and all they have to go on is a composite sketch drawn from the customer's memory and a description of his appearance and vehicle. He was dressed like a metalhead, wearing a Megadeth t-shirt, a black earring shaped like a cross, and a skull ring. And he was believed to be the owner of a black van with a Megadeth mural airbrushed onto the side. Police are hoping that someone comes forward and helps to identify the man. Iaggi passed a polygraph and was ruled out as a suspect, and the naked man who chased Deborah at her workplace was never identified. In 2002, authorities said they had identified a suspect in the case but refused to publicly name the individual. Around the same time, they searched some land near a church where Iaggi was once a pastor. It's unclear whether the person they refused to name is still a suspect. Number 4. Stephen Chidawa. After finishing an overnight shift at a hospital in Leeds, England in 2022, 45-year-old social worker Stephen Chidawa went home, took a shower and went to bed. A few hours later, his wife Stacey found him unresponsive and realized he wasn't just asleep. Paramedics rushed to the scene, where they spent 45 minutes trying to revive Chidawa before concluding that they couldn't save him. An autopsy found that Chidawa had a fatal amount of alcohol in his system, roughly 5 times the legal limit for driving, according to a toxicology test. But Stacey insisted that he didn't seem drunk when he arrived home that morning. He also didn't smell of booze, and there were no indicators that he had been drinking. No empty bottles, no strange behavior, nothing. Chidawa wasn't a daily drinker, and after being married to him for 15 years, Stacey could instantly tell if he had been drinking. She would have known if he was intoxicated or trying to hide a secret habit, because he would have been acting noticeably out of character. There was also no mention of suspected alcohol use in the reports taken by responding paramedics. It would be extremely unusual for EMTs to notice signs of drinking and not take note of it. The autopsy also found traces of heavy narcotic sedatives in Chidawa's system, only adding to the mystery surrounding his death. Following an inquest, senior coroner Kevin McLaughlin admitted that the case had left him and his colleagues stumped. He said that the amount of alcohol in Chidawa's body was one of the highest levels he had ever seen, but conceded that the evidence, or lack thereof rather, failed to explain how the respected hospital worker got so much alcohol into his system to begin with. Unfortunately, the inquest failed to procure the answers that Chidawa's family, friends, and co-workers had hoped for. Number 3. Lee Sheppard. New Zealand national Lee Sheppard was ecstatic to learn that he was going to be a father in 2003. He was looking forward to the future, so when he vanished from his workplace in North London just 5 nights later, his loved ones immediately knew that he didn't purposely disappear. Sheppard clocked in for the night shift at a metal recycling plant, but he never clocked out, and his bank activity stopped completely. Based on surveillance footage, it appeared as though he never left the building, yet he was nowhere to be found, leading investigators to suspect that he somehow snuck away from the property or met with foul play without being seen on camera. Police concluded that Sheppard was last seen after 2 o'clock in the morning by a Ukrainian co-worker named Dmytro Oliferenko. Due to his immigration status, Oliverenko was reluctant to speak to detectives, and he offered little in the way of helpful information. 5 years later, Sheppard's family hired a private investigator who persuaded police to revisit the case file. With no forensic evidence to indicate what became of the missing father-to-be, the entirely circumstantial case went before a panel of jurors at the North London Coroner's Court. After reviewing the evidence, they concluded that Sheppard was crushed to death by a 44-ton, 40 metric tons machine that was capable of crushing 10 refrigerators at once. As part of the inquest, police re-interviewed Oliverenko. He was a lot more forthcoming the second time around and revealed that the fridge crusher had malfunctioned on the night of Sheppard's disappearance. Shortly after Sheppard was last seen, the machine experienced an unexplained blockage in its chamber. Oliverenko admitted that he and his co-workers suspected that Sheppard had been crushed and that none of them wanted to look inside the crusher to see what was causing the blockage. He gave conflicting stories about whether it was possible or realistic for an employee to have an accident while working on the machine, but after considering the circumstances, the jury felt comfortable ruling that Sheppard met his demise under the fridge crusher's weight. After years of pushing for answers, his family said they were satisfied with the conclusion and that it helped to bring them some semblance of closure. Number 2. Kelly BERGH Dove. While working third shift at a gas station in Harrisonburg, Virginia one night in 1982, 20-year-old Kelly BERGH Dove dialed 911 and reported that she was receiving obscene phone calls. She asked the police to check on her, but they still hadn't arrived when she called 911 a second time at 2:30 in the morning and said that a male customer who drove up to the station in a silver Ford was harassing her. Kelly mentioned that he had been in the store earlier and that he was improperly dressed. She also said that she had received another inappropriate phone call right after he pulled into the parking lot the second time, leading her to suspect that he had something to do with the harassing calls. By that point, Kelly sounded noticeably panicked. Police arrived at her workplace 2 minutes later, only to discover that she had vanished seemingly into thin air. There were no signs of a struggle, but her purse had been left behind. The young woman hasn't been seen since, and no arrests were ever made, leaving her family without answers for 40 years and counting. Shortly after Kelly disappeared, a sketch artist created a composite drawing of a man who was wanted in the area for indecent exposure. But detectives also avoided getting tunnel vision since they lacked any concrete reason to zero in on the unidentified man or to rule out other possible suspects. A lot of people criticized the police for failing to report to the scene sooner, but what's done is done, and they unfortunately can't go back in time and handle the situation differently. At this point, Kelly's loved ones understand that she's probably not alive. In fact, she was declared legally dead in 1989, 7 years after she went missing. But they still want to know what happened to her and who's responsible, and if they're still alive, for that person to be brought to justice. Investigators reopened the case in 2020, but as time passes and people grow old, the likelihood of speaking to someone with valuable information decreases. Law enforcement admitted that they're racing against the clock to solve the case, and they encouraged members of the public to come forward if they believed they might be able to help. Authorities also asked for help identifying the man in the composite sketch, who they've narrowed down as their main person of interest. There are currently no other suspects in the case. Number 1. Susan Giovanniello. After finishing the graveyard shift as an EMT in Long Island, New York one morning in April 2023, 19-year-old Susan Giovanniello returned to her home in Glen Cove. Shortly after arriving, she suddenly collapsed. Her fellow paramedics rushed to the scene and tried to save her, but they were unable to revive the young woman. Susan's friends, family, and co-workers were both devastated and mystified by her death. After all, healthy 19-year-olds don't typically collapse and die out of nowhere. While it's clear that Susan suffered some sort of medical emergency, her death was still under investigation according to the most recent updates. Local authorities have classified the incident as a line-of-duty death. Regardless of what ripped Susan's life out from beneath her at such a young age, her loss has left a void in the lives of those who knew and worked with her. Thanks for watching. If you worked the night shift at a gas station and recognized a clearly distressed customer as a missing person in the custody of their visibly agitated kidnapper, would you spring into action and intervene directly, putting your own safety at risk? Wait until they left and call the police, even though that would give the abductor a chance to evade capture, or do something else? Let us know in the comments below, and remember to subscribe. See you soon. Bye.